Good morning. Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be back with you this morning. I understand you had a very nice evening yesterday, and I'm sure that's a good sign of all the networking and conversations that have taken place and continued throughout the evening, but will continue still today. And we're going to continue focusing, of course, on our theme as we started yesterday, fighting impunity. The road to accountability and justice is going to be the focus of more discussions, and we will continue not only this morning, but this afternoon also in various breakout sessions. The civil society representatives and human rights defenders need to have their voice heard, and we're going to listen to you more and take in more input from you throughout the day again. Since we have another busy day ahead of us, I'm not going to delay any further. I'll come back to you with some practical information just before coffee break. But I would first of all like to invite our first speaker this morning, and I know you're all waiting for his intervention. So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Eamon Gilmore, EU Special Representative for Human Rights and EU Special Envoy for the Colombian peace process. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Florence. It's a great pleasure to be with you again today. This forum, I think, has always been a standout moment for us each year to meet and to discuss the most pressing human rights issues on our shared agenda. And as I said yesterday, I'm delighted that we're able to do so again in person. And I know that it is going very well so far. This year's focus on stopping impunity and building the road to accountability and justice is a topic whose moment has come. Today, accountability dominates political discourse and all of our work. Yesterday morning, the High Representative painted a vivid picture of the global challenges that we all face in human rights and democracy, as well as the lack of respect for international humanitarian law. He spoke of the need for accountability for the war crimes being committed around the world, in Tigray, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Myanmar, in Palestine, and of course in Ukraine, and many more. When I think about accountability, I think firstly of the incredibly brave people and their families that I meet in the course of my work around the world. People like Kakwanza Rukarbashia, the Ugandan writer in exile who was tortured in prison, and he now fears for his life if he returns to Uganda. I think of Olena Yuzbak, a doctor from Hostomel, a city in the outskirts of Kiev. Olena told me how she, her husband, and their son were captured and tortured by Russian soldiers. Plastic bags put over their heads to half suffocate them, and her husband was shot in the knee. And while she and her husband were eventually freed, their son Dimitro was not. That was 9 months ago, and she doesn't know where he is, or even if he is still alive. I think of Lenar Palacios, who lost 32 family members in May 2002 in Bahia in Colombia, when a cylinder bomb was fired by the FARC into a church. And in that church, there were 500 people who were sheltering from clashes between the FARC and paramilitaries. 79 people were killed by that bomb, and Lenar went on to be a member of the Colombian Truth Commission. And I think of Narges Mohammadi, who is in prison in Iran for her human rights work. She's not been allowed to speak to her children for over a year and hasn't seen them in 7 years. Accountability and justice for all these people and many more is vital. Human rights are not something to be granted by the few to the many, nor are they imposed or earned. They are part of all of us, and they're at the heart of our humanity. No one can give us rights, but they can certainly take them away. Sometimes, when we think about the many human rights and humanitarian crises in the world today, when we survey the atrocities being committed in conflicts on every continent, and when we reflect on the scale of the brutality, the effect can sometimes be overwhelming. It sometimes feels that the perpetrators can do anything they like because they get away with it. And it is certainly true that we have been living through an age of impunity. But I believe that the era of impunity is coming to an end, and I hope that we're about to enter a new age of accountability, and that's what I want to talk with you about this morning. And let me tell you why. Firstly, there is a renewed focus on accountability. This forum is a case in point. Accountability is the cornerstone of human rights. It is critical to the relationship between states as duty bearers and individuals as rights holders affected by their actions. Accountability carries with it the obligation of those in power to take responsibility for their actions, to answer for them to those affected, and to be subject to some form of enforceable sanction if their conduct or explanation is found wanting. There have to be consequences. When there are none, impunity festers, which results in violations recurring over and over again. Rights cannot be fully respected, protected, or fulfilled unless there is accountability. Secondly, the International Criminal Court has renewed its purpose and its practical relevance. When we last met in person 3 years ago, the ICC was undergoing an existential crisis. Some countries were threatening to leave. The United States was imposing sanctions on its officials. But the European Union strongly defended the ICC, particularly its independence and importance. And today, the ICC is stronger than ever, and this year it celebrated 20 years of helping states to advance and to achieve justice. The ICC has helped numerous states to develop their domestic systems and capacities in order to deal with atrocity crimes at home. But more needs to be done, and this will require more resources to enable the court to exercise jurisdiction over all 4 crimes under the Rome Statute. And we must also find a way to enable the UN Security Council to refer cases to the ICC. Thirdly, I believe that we are at a moment of great mobilisation and momentum on accountability. The ICC was ready within days to launch an investigation into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There has been, I think, an unprecedented mobilisation for accountability in Ukraine. We support the Ukrainian authorities as a first responder to achieve accountability. We assist the Office of the Prosecutor General by providing training, expertise and equipment through our EU delegation and our EU advisory mission to Ukraine. We have provided additional financial support to strengthen the investigation capacities of the ICC, which will support all ICC investigations. The EU has also changed the legal basis of Eurojust to enable Eurojust to preserve, analyse and store evidence relating to core international crimes. Through Eurojust, the EU is also supporting a joint investigation team established by Ukraine and EU member states to facilitate the collection and sharing of evidence on international crimes to strengthen national investigations and prosecutions. We need now to capitalise on this extraordinary moment for international criminal justice and to make the Ukraine momentum the standard for fighting impunity in other parts of the world. The credibility of the criminal justice system as a whole hinges on this. As Martin Luther King once said, Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In Ukraine, we have seen a massive coordinated effort to ensure that the evidence is available for future cases. But this is happening elsewhere too. For example, evidence collected and preserved by the IIIM and UNITAD is helping to bring some of those responsible for the most heinous crimes in Syria and Iraq to justice. The fourth reason that I believe we are entering into an age of accountability is because of technology. Developments in digitalization have made it almost impossible for violators of human rights and international humanitarian law to hide themselves or their crimes. Even in the most repressive of societies, mobile phones can record what is happening, and satellite imagery can provide an early warning system of violations and atrocities, focusing attention on what is really happening on the ground. Even when evidence is destroyed and people are silenced forever, accountability can still be achieved. Forensic technology is advancing all the time. When I visited the International Commission for Missing Persons in The Hague a couple of years ago, I remember that they explained to me how they had managed to identify a man decades later who had been killed in Srebrenica. They did this through DNA analysis, even though his remains were reburied in 18 different locations. This is hugely important for the victims of families as well as for the prosecution of crimes. The fifth reason is that other actors are also leading the way in advancing accountability, notably the private sector. Businesses and companies are increasingly playing, and indeed are expected to play, a critical role in the promotion and protection of human rights. And we saw companies playing an important leadership role in reaction to the invasion of Ukraine, with several high-profile investors halting operations in Russia in response to that aggression. In February this year, the European Commission adopted a legislative proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. This will require companies operating in the EU market to identify and address the human rights and environmental impacts of their operations and value chains. The new rules will bring benefits to consumers, investors and businesses through legal certainty and a level playing field. And ultimately, these new rules will enhance accountability. And all of this is reflected in the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, which was agreed unanimously by all of our 27 member states, and is the principal vehicle for the work of the European Union on human rights and democracy around the world. The plan has a strong focus on closing the accountability gap, fighting impunity and supporting transitional justice. This applies at bilateral and multilateral levels. One of the primary tools produced by the action plan in this area is the Global Human Rights Sanction Regime, and last year was the first year of its operation. And as you know, the European Union has already adopted restrictive measures targeting persons and entities in a number of countries. The sixth reason is that the use of the principle of universal jurisdiction, which means that individuals can be prosecuted for crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide and torture, no matter where these crimes took place. And we have seen this being exercised in several high-profile cases. All of this means that in this new age, it will be harder to hide a war crime, harder to conceal an atrocity, and more difficult to destroy evidence of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. The perpetrators of an atrocity anywhere in the world today, the commander who oversaw that atrocity, and the political leader who authorized it, can never feel free again. They will carry their crimes with them forever. They can never again walk through an international airport without running the risk of arrest on foot of a warrant from the ICC or from a special tribunal or from the prosecution of an individual country exercising universal jurisdiction. The perpetrators of an atrocity can never feel free sending a child to a school or university in a country that has imposed sanctions like under the EU Global Human Rights Sanctions regime. And even if the perpetrators feel that these freedoms do not matter, that they're never going to leave their country anyway, they can never feel safe, even from their own autocrats, who will readily sacrifice them if the evidence of the crimes emerges in the public domain. And the autocrats themselves can also be dispatched to The Hague to face their accusers as, if sometimes happens, the regime is changed. Human rights defenders and civil society are essential partners in all of these efforts, and support to both defenders and civil society is central to the work of the European Union. The High Representative mentioned some of the ways we provide support in his remarks yesterday, and let me assure you that every day, the 140 EU delegations that we have in countries around the world, together with the embassies of our 27 member states, are working with human rights defenders and with civil society organisations, providing and communicating EU support. This is not just financial and practical support. We also provide political support through the engagement that we have with different countries, through our human rights dialogues with more than 60 countries and regional organisations, and through our political engagements. And next year, it is 75 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This will be an important moment to reflect on where we are and what we need to do and how we can do it better together, and above all, to celebrate the Declaration. The Universal Declaration was born out of conflict, out of a disregard and contempt for human rights that have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. It is our common language of our shared humanity. It imagines the world as it should be, but the barbarous acts are still with us today. I believe that we are turning a corner from the era of impunity to an age of accountability. This is not some idle hope or misplaced optimism. The Irish Nobel Prize-winning poet Seamus Heaney, paraphrasing Václav Havel, once said, "Hope is not optimism, which expects things to turn out well, but something rooted in the conviction that there is good worth working for." Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now, I understood you've agreed to take one or two questions.
Only if they're easy questions.
So we'll group the questions if there are any, and please make them short and to the point. Do we have one question or two? Yes, the gentleman on that side. Hold on a second. We need to give you the mic because we're recorded.
Okay, my name is Hassan Beliti. I was very much impressed by something the speaker said about perpetrators not feeling safe to pass through an international airport. Our work arrested a suspected Liberian war criminals through Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, in the United States. My question to you is, even though the United States did that arrest based on universal jurisdiction, there are states that are very much reluctant to do this. What, if anything, is the EU prepared to do with respect to states not complying to their international treaty obligations?
Thank you. Do we have another question maybe, and we can group them? Yes, we have a lady on that side. I'm sorry, but we can't take 4 questions. We're going to take 2. So can we have a very quick point?
Okay.
And then we'll turn to the lady over there, and that will be it. I'm sorry.
Ok, merci. Moi, c'est Dr. Daouda Dia.
Thank you. I'm Doda Diallo. I come from Burkina Faso. This is a Sahel country. Please, could you wait a second just so that we can listen in to the interpretation? Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you very much. So, I am Dr. Daura Diallo. I come from Burkina Faso. I'm a humanist. I am in favor, of course, I'm an activist of human rights, and I'm very committed in my country, in the Sahel. And today, I've noticed that what happens in the Sahel region is not enough in the media. It's not taken into consideration enough. However, many civil populations, many civilians die every day while authorities do not say anything. National authorities do not say anything because these national authorities.
Donc, ce que
Please be brief. Yes, so as I was saying, how could we make sure that atrocities that are happening today in the Sahel region can be taken into account? How can we make sure that the victims are benefiting from an international help?
Thank you very much, Mr. Gilmer. I'm Marax Malkonian, Protection of Rights Without Borders, Armenia. I wonder whether there will be sanctions or stopping impunity regarding the Aliyev regime in Azerbaijan, because currently, as I don't think that many here, the audience, know, Aliyev regime is blocking the only road of leading to NKR from Armenia, cut gas supply to Nagorno-Karabakh, causing shortage of food, medicine, and other supplies in this freezing winter area. And yesterday, Mr. Borrell actually stated in his speech that there is no justification to put people in situation without heating and without light concerning Ukraine situation. So I wonder whether this crime, which is war crime and crime against humanity, will be punished, and whether EU will sanction this regime. Thank you very much. Because when you speak that the war criminals
I'm sorry, I'm
cannot...
afraid we got your question. I'm sorry, we
Okay,
have to
thank
stop
you.
here. Sorry, but we have to be conscious of the time that the special representative also has dedicated to us. So please.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, three questions. First of all, on the first question about states that are reluctant to meet their international obligations and states that don't comply with them. Of course, states should be complying. That's the first thing. And the difficulty that we're faced with is, what do we do when states don't comply? In the area of international criminal justice, I think one of the central means that we have is through the International Criminal Court. One of the difficulties, of course, with the International Criminal Court is that there are still 45 states that have not ratified the Rome Statute, including some very big states. What we do in the EU is we try to encourage those states to ratify the Rome Statute, to become part of the International Criminal Court, to come under its jurisdiction. And we'll continue to do that. And we're seeing some gradual progress. We'd like to see more, like to see it happening faster. And then the second is that we look at the other means of achieving accountability, and I listed some of those in my contribution. And I think that what we are seeing is an increased range of accountability mechanisms, firstly. But secondly, I think we're also seeing, and I think Ukraine is probably the high point of this, because I think what we have seen in Ukraine is a mobilization for accountability, for evidence gathering, for the preservation of evidence that we've not seen before. Perhaps we should have seen it. Certainly we should have seen it. But we are seeing it now in the case of Ukraine. And I think that what we should look to is to ensure that that works in the case of Ukraine. And then secondly, to ensure that that Ukraine momentum, or that Ukraine model, if you like, becomes the standard that is applied elsewhere in the world. And that is also the case in the Sahel, where you've talked about the atrocities that are taking place every day, and how we can ensure that those atrocities are met and are addressed. It's not easy. And I think, again, I think when we're looking at the area of accountability, the most important people when we're talking about accountability are the victims and survivors. And accountability, unfortunately, does not happen quickly. Sometimes we're looking at cases not being pursued for several years after the atrocity takes place. But I think that the message that I want to communicate this morning is that I think that we are actually entering into a new age on this, for all of the reasons that I've said. That still does not mean that we're going to see it happening very quickly. That will still mean that there will be a great deal of frustration and pain for victims. But I think probably the most important thing that will, I think, emerge from this new age of accountability is a new sense, particularly which I hope will impact on perpetrators, on those who command them and those who control them, that the age of getting away with it is over, and that however long it may take, they run the risk. It's not certain that they will be caught. It's not certain that they will be arrested walking through an airport, or that their assets will be frozen, or that any of the different things will happen to them. But they will run that risk for the rest of their lives, that they will never be able to escape the shadow of the crime that they have committed. And on the question from the colleague from Armenia, yes, the High Representative was very clear on this yesterday. Taking military action to take out electricity, to take out energy, to deprive people of heating, of water, of light, of the means of cooking, of means of communication, because of course without electricity you lose your communication as well. That these are horrific crimes, and that they also cry out for accountability. And that applies in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and anywhere else where this type of war tactic is pursued. Will the European Union impose sanctions for it? That's a decision that member states have to make. I don't have a role in the sanctions process. It's established for member states to do that, but I have no doubt that they will hear what you're saying and hear what's coming from this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for taking the time. Now, I know some of you had prearranged meetings, so if that is the case, feel free to leave the room now before we move on to our next event. And we're now going to open the first panel of the day. We have with us here in the room, I'll just give you a minute or two to go away. Yes, just one thing, a reminder of the interpretation channels for those of you who may not have had one. Thank you. I'm getting also a headset. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's only if you had a prearranged meeting. If you don't, please, let's move on So we're now going to invite our speakers for the first panel, and it's a pleasure to welcome Nada Al-Nashif, who is the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Chiara Adamo, and I'm going to get out of the way, who is a Director for Human Development, Governance, Peace at the European Commission. We have Alexander Cherkasov, who's the chair of the Human Rights Center Memorial in Russia, and Khaled Kuzmar, who's the General Director at Defense for Children International in Palestine, as well as Drissa Traoré from the Ivory Coast movement, Mouvement Ivoirien des Droits Humains. Welcome to you all. Good morning. I'm afraid that should be my seat so that I can see all of you. I need to see all of you so that I can talk to all of you. Don't worry, that's okay. So good morning to you all, and welcome. We will together in this panel look at the role of human rights defenders and victims in stopping impunity. And it will be a deeper look into a conversation that we already started yesterday morning. Sorry. The organizations like the ones some of you represent have an essential role in supporting the victims of human rights violation. And at the same time, you also face a lot of challenges and a lot of threats in your daily work. And you need to be protected. So I'll invite all of you to share your experience and your stories with us and help us understand better the challenges that you face every day. And we'll also hear from colleagues on the institutional side, their reactions and how they support the work that you do. In particular, of course, in the context of crisis and conflicts, which is the context we've been focusing on. But before I turn to you and invite you to share your experience, I would like to invite all of you to watch a video message from Vilma Núñez de Escorcia, who's a lawyer and human rights activist in Nicaragua.
Un saludo a todos los presentes. Soy Vilma Núñez de Escorcia.
I greet everyone here. I am Victa Núñez de Corcia, president of the Nicaraguan Center of Jesus Gado, which is an outlawed association that was haphazardly outlawed by a dictatorial regime. I am speaking from Nicaragua to denounce the repression and the humanitarian crisis in human rights in my country. Since April 2018, 355 people have been murdered and more than 150,000 Nicaraguans have gone to exile. Thousands of people have been hurt, damaged, prosecuted, and also arbitrarily detained, imprisoned. And we have all been surveying and documented these actions, and we have been walking along with repression victims, along with the international human rights organizations. We have documented 113 cases of extra legal detentions that are crimes against humanity. And this represents a lack of independence of the legal power, which has supported the terror regime of Daniel Ortega and his wife Rosario Murillo. After more than 4 years of the social demonstrations, violence continues to happen from the different vigilante groups, and the repression increases along with the destruction of the civic spaces that are arbitrarily closing more civil organizations. The purpose of the regime is to end with the independence of the civil society. As of today, 225 persons are still imprisoned because of political reasons, and most of them have been condemned without any guarantees in their process. They have been locked in prison and they are suffering from torture, as well as inhuman and degrading circumstances. Among them, 10 priests, as well as Rolando Alvarez, the archbishop, who was kidnapped. And this is a very big evidence of the Catholic Church persecution. Our efforts and those of the international community must be geared towards searching the immediate release of these people because their lives are at risk. We are absolutely rejecting the Ortega Murillo regime as well as their mechanisms, and we hope to have the human rights mechanisms aid as well as denunciating the lack of attention of the international call towards justice. And we continue to insist through this forum for everyone to have an active solidarity towards repression that all Nicaraguans are living, and so that we can live freely in peace and in democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening message. To all five of you, and I'll ask you to please stick to time in terms of your responses so that we can try and have a few minutes for questions and answers with our audience, because I know it's very frustrating when you're listening to speakers and you cannot ask your questions. So we'll try and manage time as well as we can. So earlier this year, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on the importance of recognizing human rights defenders in advancing human rights in conflicts and post-conflict situations. And in many crises, we still see many campaigns happening which are aiming at attacking the credibility of human rights defenders, and especially women defenders, which is an issue we also discussed yesterday, particularly in some of the breakout rooms. So, Drissa, I will start with you. In the context of West Africa, what's done to counter these negative narratives? It's on, don't worry. You don't have to worry about it. Somebody else will switch it on.
Merci, mesdames, messieurs.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to say that within the states on our continent, the position of the defenders are appreciated according to the different parties, so governments or oppositions. And I will now talk about the question of power. As an example, I will talk about the last report published by the FIDA in Mali. And this report was published in Dakar, not in Bamako, for the simple reason that we had some information that could be a threat to security. Because actually, nowadays, the governments in the different states do not want human rights defenders speak about what is taking place, about the reality. Especially, there is a feeling today, and it's an anti-Western feeling, and the human rights defenders are assimilated to agents of the Western world. This is why it is difficult for us to work and to roll out all our actions. So what we try to do is to work as part of networks and to work with people that accept to talk despite these difficult conditions. And at the same time, we have to question the position of our defenders, because it is not easy to have some defenders go to other countries, to other towns, to make sure that they are protected. I would like to say that the question about the work of HRD in Africa is something very difficult. And it is a work in which we don't necessarily have the space, the resources, and the safety. So the defenders are always in danger, at risk. So what we try to do as part of the FIDH is that we have some lawyers that are assisting, and
aident les défenseurs
We have these lawyers that are helping defenders to collect information, but also to make sure that they can stay safe.
Human rights defenders are usually impacted psychologically as well. It's not just the job that they do, it's psychologically and physically. And the risk that they run in their everyday job has just been highlighted by Drissa. So do you think, or do human rights defenders and civil society recognize the need to psychologically protect their workers? Is there really a recognition of that? And what do they put in place to do so if they recognize the need to protect them, psychologically at least?
Thank you very much for raising these questions. Really, I lived it myself. To start with the psychological issue, I started to work as a defense lawyer in the Israeli military courts to represent the children who are in the prosecuted in the military courts. So I worked the first few years normal, but when I get married and I have children, so I reached the point that I'm representing children in the age of my kids. So by the time I become like aggressive with my children when they ask me to go to a restaurant or to enjoy, to go out in the car, while I left behind children behind the bars without any care, without families, and even subject to torture and ill treatment. So after about 20 years work in such circumstances, I decided to stop being a lawyer, and I went to Ireland. I studied international human rights law and humanitarian law for 1 year, and when I came back, completely I couldn't go back to the court, and then I had another work in my organization. So the second question, second point, please.
It's what organizations put in place to protect their workers psychologically.
Yes. I'm so happy being here this 2 days and only talk about accountability, justice, stop impunity, but I feel that I'm like dreaming, because when I'm back, myself, I'm a risk. As you know, not only human rights people are paying the price of the occupation and subject to violation, but also those who are talking or defending the children or the civilians who are subject to torture or treatment or injured, also they are targeted. So maybe all of you heard about the designation of the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations. My organization is established in 1991. We continue the work as usual, but for more than 10 years, we have been subject to smear campaigns from Israeli right-wing groups, from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they failed within more than 10 years to silence us. We kept committed to our mission, continued the work, but when they failed, they took a military action against us. They raided our offices without any notification. They confiscated computers, files, and even that we continue the work, but finally they designated us a terrorist organization. Designated us a terrorist organization means that the staff is in risk and subject to sentence in prison for for up to 20 years. The beneficiaries are subject also to be prosecuted in a military court. Anyone cooperate with this organization will be subject to. So how to defend? I'm happy to hear that accountability is now in the desk of the international community and especially in the EU. But I'm so happy with the speech of Mr. Imam. But what to say to the victims in Palestine? Wait until we will finish the case of Ukraine and then we'll be back. I think this is all the time I feel that we are under frustration from the action from the international community to protect the human rights defenders and, of course, the civilians. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to Russia and Alexander. Alexander, Memorial, the organization that you work for, was shut down earlier this year. And at the same time, very shortly afterwards, it was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So that it's really been a very special year for you, a very emotional year as well, I'm sure. And you now continue to defend the rights of Russian citizens and victims while in exile. So how can you, and how can other organizations in your case, how can you continue to do your work? And how does the Russian civil society keep the fight against impunity alive? Since some of you are in exile, some of you are still in Russia, how can the work continue?
Мы умудряемся работать, потому что...
Well, we've been managing to continue working. Myself and my colleagues believe that this is extremely important to continue working. Yeah, at first they declared us foreign agents, and this smear campaign started 10 years ago. First, they restricted our opportunities for working. The head of our office in the Chechen Republic was detained, and he was in prison for 1.5 years on trumped up charges. We managed to ensure his release due to international support. Broad international support. It was more costly for the authorities to keep the guy in prison than to tolerate his activities. So he is free now and continues to work. But is such solidarity and such a reaction of authorities possible now in the current conditions, when Russia is no longer shy in waging a war, and it feels invulnerable? It feels, like they will not be subject to criticism by the international public opinion. We have always used certain legal instruments, but recently these instruments have helped us to show this impunity, to showcase it. Ramzan Kadyrov and the private military company Wagner and their guerrillas, they enjoy impunity. So we have been doing this, we've done this work already after being banned. So how can you go to the court in Russia against the private military company? And they're very brutal, these guerrillas. So, of course, my colleagues are very much aware of the risks that they are facing, however, they are continuing. In 2009, Natalia Estimirova, my colleague, and a lady who was very involved in human rights activities in Chechnya, she was investigating cases of kidnapping, and she was kidnapped herself, and she was found dead. So it looks like we don't have any protection mechanisms in Russia. The European Human Rights Court had jurisdiction over Russia, but in Russia we failed to achieve justice in respect of Natalia Stemirova's case. However, in the court of Strasbourg, it was terrible because it was clear that the authorities play a role, but the decision was made that their fault was for failing to investigate, but they were not brought to accountability in any other respects. And this is outrageous. That means those who were in charge of this dossier were incompetent. And now we see that Russian authorities feel totally invulnerable, they feel impunity.
Никому в общем не нужно.
And it looks like our work is not needed. After the year 2000, the level of demands, requirements towards Russia has been decreasing, and all the issues that we have been putting on the agenda, have been ignored, and human rights defenders in Russia started to appear very, in serious people, and so I think the most important thing is to recognize, to accept how important human rights defenders' activities are, and we are talking about threats, and we are talking about protection, because this would mean protection as well of those European structures that have been fighting Putin's regime and its impunity. If they feel that this is of no interest, that of course the Russian regime would think that anything is possible, they can do whatever they like. So the European international structures are very important. We need to bring attention to these to human rights defenders and their activities, and respect them. Thank you.
Nada, we know that the UN plays an absolutely a fundamental role in crises and conflicts, and it does cooperate with all the relevant actors, including with human rights defenders. Now, you've heard these testimonies of our speakers. How can you protect human rights defenders and victims and civil society representatives and make sure that everybody can play their role in ensuring the accountability that we've been talking about?
Thanks very much. And let me start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here despite the subject matter. We rarely discuss other subject matters in the Office of the High Commissioner, but I think it's fantastic to be with such a courageous group. And let me just say that the world is particularly unwell at this moment. I think we have a sense of multiple crises across the world and multiple setbacks. And I think this is very important to understand, that we are unraveling, unhinging, because of unprecedented inequalities, I think, because of multiple, water, energy, food and fuel prices unraveling, so economic, social, cultural rights also gravely imperiled, all of which really undermines our possibility to make the progress that we want on the ground. Let me say that for us, this is a critical entry point into participation. We are fully committed to amplifying the voice of human rights defenders, particularly in the office, particularly women human rights defenders, I think, and this is a special point of mention, often silenced or ignored, particularly those working in conflict. And I'm very glad we started with Nicaragua, because I think we also have the sense that we need to keep the attention span on all conflicts, very difficult. The world has an attention deficit disorder. Certainly, it's very hard to keep an eye on everything. But I think we must not forget the Myanmars and the Afghanistans. For us, the Sahel was mentioned earlier, and certainly in South America. But I think that what we do and will continue to do is support the creation of platforms and opportunities to hear those voices, very importantly, while being very aware, as we heard now with the example from Palestine, to be sensitive to the threats and the risks that they are taking when we give them visibility. This is very important, and therefore this threat assessment is always a part of what we do. We also have to make more effective internal institutional procedures, establish better understanding of these risk assessments so that we can make the right interventions. And particularly now moving to the new realities with technology, and Mr. Gilmore mentioned that, a lot of pluses about technology, but also some safeguards that need to be, I think we see a lot of the need to, with online and offline now harassment taking place, we need to be even more sure how we can monitor and respond in the sense of surveillance and other things that go on, and the engagement of private companies. Again, very important that they are stepping up in many parts of the world, but also social media platforms that need to help us move together to diminish risks, which is very important. I think also to make sure that protection responds to the needs of particularly vulnerable and marginalized communities. And I mean, of course, women and youth everywhere threatened, but also migrants, persons with disabilities, minorities, and how we can guarantee their inclusion internationally, regionally, at the national level, and particularly working on national policies.
Thank you very much. Chiara, turning to you now, because we've heard about the various things that are put in place or not put in place within organizations to support and protect the human rights defenders. And how can the EU support them even more? And I'm thinking in particular of the groups that Nada just mentioned, the underrepresented groups. Of course, there are women, but there's also representatives of the LGBTQ community, for instance, and you also need in your work to pay attention to the measures that could potentially backfire and prove difficult to counter afterwards. So how can you juggle with all these aspects?
Thank you. And first of all, let me also join in paying my tribute to the human rights defenders who gave us their testimonies in the panel. It's really humbling to share a panel with you. And with that, I really wanted to express the solidarity and the full support of my institutions of the European Union. You heard our High Representative Borrell. You have the political support of our institutions. You heard Eamon Gilmore. You have the diplomatic support throughout the networks of our delegations on the ground, and you also have our operational support, as my Commissioner Urpilainen mentioned yesterday. So I will focus on the operational side of what we can do to contribute to protect the incredible work that you do, that human rights defenders and human rights organizations do daily. And starting with that, let me say that we are quite proud of this figure we always mention, that in the last 7 years we were able to individually protect 55,000 individual human rights defenders and their families. But also let me say that we are less proud of the fact that we could have helped more, because we got more requests than what was possible to cope with in these last years. That's why we are literally redoubling our efforts. The new mechanism we put in place for the protection of human rights defenders through a great consortium of NGOs, the Protect Defenders EU, is really doubling the budget, because in the end, I mean, that is also what is needed, resources. And this doubling of the budget should allow really to support human rights defenders in a holistic way, looking at different groups, as you mentioned, women human rights defenders, LGBTI defenders, human rights defenders who are actually lawyers and become human rights defenders even without realizing that, and journalists. So the psychosocial situation, of course, it's also something that will be in focus of the new of this new mechanism, which I'm sure you all know about. It provides relocation possibility, it provides really swift support, legal aid, medical aid, etc. It is indeed difficult sometimes for the EU, particularly on the ground, to come in because for different reasons. First of all, we have the do not harm principle very much in mind. And for that reason, we find different means to continue our support. For instance, going through empowering human rights regional organizations. So for instance, we are supporting the Southern African Human Rights Litigation Center Trust, and through that organization, which is local and locally managed, we can protect LGBTI rights in Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Eswatini. So this is just an example of one way to go about it. The last point I wanted to make is that indeed today we are focusing on situations where we have closed spaces, where the human rights violations are widespread, crisis situations. But we need to really also think very much about prevention. When you talk about smear campaigns, typically smear campaigns are the early signs of the deterioration often of an environment for civil society. And on that, I believe that we really need to step up. So I'm also glad to announce that we are putting forward a new mechanism for 50 million euros. It's a bold new mechanism for early detection and monitoring of the enabling environment for civil societies. So to really be able to be more alerted, to be able to come earlier in a swifter manner to identify where there can be needs for swift responses. So the mechanism will be about monitoring, but also about providing possibility for swift response. I think about advocacy, I think about starting litigation or and support all the work that you do on the ground. So I think it is important that we look at these issues comprehensively because situations, and we have seen in the last couple of years, as she rightly mentioned, we are in an increasingly polarized world, a world where we see that in the last year, double of the countries are going towards autocratization rather than democratization. So in these situations, the space for human rights organizations to operate can shrink very, very quickly. So we need to be more efficient in coping with that.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you. I have a question to our three human rights defenders. You can play a role in the dialogue and the mediation between the different actors, and you can also empower victims in the efforts towards transitional victims. So how can you do that? What kind of role can you play in that sense? And maybe I'll start with you, Khaled.
It is a very difficult topic. And just I will give you an example. We work with children, raise their awareness about their rights according to the international law, and there is international law can protect your rights. So one of the sessions was to arrange a meeting for them with the director of the High Commission for Human Rights Office in Ramallah. Unfortunately, Mr. James was denied fulfilling his mandate, and he kept more than 2 years sitting in Geneva. So the children asked him how you can protect our life. Our colleagues were killed a few days ago, and then what you can do. So he was laughing that myself, I cannot come to fulfill my mandate. And this is now, it's very much clear after the designation when they considered our organization as a terrorist organization. Children slept that night very well, and they waked up that those who are talking about human rights and offering protection through the human rights law, now they are considered as a terrorist. So it was a very, very bad message. It took from us more than 6 months working with them far from the offices in order just to show them that this is what they took is something not much serious, but still we are supported by the international law, by international community, maybe like what I'm here, I hear a lot of things that we are fully protected and supported, but when I go back to the ground, things is different. So this is why when we talk about stop impunity, I think it is very, very important component in order to minimize the damage and the crimes. Those who are committing these crimes since more than 70 years in Palestine and live under full impunity without any real action from the international community to force them to stop these crimes, I believe that nothing will be changed. I know that the situation in Palestine is not much different than others, but really after 70 years of continuous crimes, just as example from my work, once I used to, in my statement in the court, to use the international law and even to talk about Child Rights Convention, direct the judge shout for me and ask me to wake up. You are not in The Hague. You are in the military court. So he is proud of his work as a judge in the military court, neglected the international law and ignored it, and just work for according to the military orders. Israel, since 1967, is the only state in the world arrested and prosecuted more than 700 Palestinian children in Israeli military court. These courts are so far from the fair trial standards. These courts are designed to punish the Palestinian, including children, and to legitimate the crimes. Child who are subject to torture and ill treatment is acceptable according to the military order system or the court system. Arresting the child in the night, subject him to torture, deny him seeing the lawyer, is considered as a legal action and accepted in the court. So this is the situation where we are. So we have no other option. Okay, I'm talking about frustration, but in the same time, we will continue our committed to our mission. We'll continue the work. And I'm not sure if I will be back to my home or to prison, because no need to interrogate me. Just being in this position after designation is subject to the sentence 20 years.
Thank you. Drissa, how do you mediate between the different actors? What role do you play in this mediation process?
Merci.
Thank you. In the framework of work, we try to maintain a dialogue with political authorities, administrative and judicial authorities, because we believe that in order to move forward, we need to make authorities understand that we need to make things change. So we launch political and judicial missions, as we call them, that allows us to talk with high authorities. And we've done it with the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, with in Mali, with the prime minister in Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea as well. And this allows us to talk with the authorities without any intermediate middlemen. Because sometimes when we need to go through middlemen, they pervert our words. So when we manage to contact directly these authorities, this allows us to help them understand better human rights. Now, why do we also work with judicial authorities? And on the African continent, most of the time, these people involved in judicial affairs do not know the international right very well. And this allows us to help them understand, to explain to them what it consists of. And it also allows us to bring victims closer to these legal authorities, because sometimes victims want to talk, but they don't know who to talk to. And now I'm going to give you the example of Guinea, where events happened 13 years ago in 2019 on the 28th of September. Political people wanted to protest, and the army repressed that demonstration. There were more than 150 people killed. And for 13 years, we have maintained a dialogue with political authorities in Guinea. We have hired lawyers so as to be able to work with legal authorities as well, so that victims could come and talk to these authorities. And 13 years later, finally, a trial has been opened. And the head of state of that time, we also have his prime minister, his minister charged with his security minister, his deputy, and we have all of these people. And this is essential so that dialogue be maintained with authorities, so that when doors are closed, we have the will to try and open those doors. But of course, we can only do it with human and financial resources. And in the case of Guinea, if 13 years later we managed to finally open a trial, well, it is because we were supported by the EU for 13 years. And we were supported by the foreign affairs ministers of France as well, who help us, give us international lawyers that accompany our lawyers so that our victims can benefit from a psychological support, can travel and come and talk with legal authorities. So we need people, but we also need financial resources. Thank you.
Maybe with a slight nuance, because can you even play that role as a mediator between the different actors?
Спасибо. У нас очень...
Thank you. In our country, we have a very specific situation. You know, I envy my colleague. He is able to contact authorities to have dialogue with them. Just 10 years ago, when we, just had first ideas about laws about foreign agents in Russia. At that time, we were already called enemies. Nevertheless, we were able to have a dialogue, for instance, about combating terrorism, about methods, how to combat terrorism in Russia. But then we were talking about using soft power, and it was efficient in various regions. We didn't want to use the blunt force because it was the source of crimes, victims, and spreading up terrorist organizations. Now it is just impossible. Today, we are a bad partner for all authorities. They don't want to meet us. It is not possible to meet foreign agents, to have contacts with them. So what is left? Of course, to spread information to everywhere, to abroad, when you have no possibilities, when you have no access to mass media, you cannot defend the project. For instance, we have a possibility to monitor arrests, criminal arrests. We see that there are protests in Russia against war, and it is very important to show Russia is not Putin. So there are thousands of people who were arrested. There are hundreds of cases in courts. People of those who are against the war with Ukraine. So external world became for us a very important partner. So Ukraine and non-governmental organizations from Ukraine are also very important to us. They are our partners. So who is in war? Civil society does not respect, does not recognize borders. So we continue our fight, and organizations who got Nobel Prize, they been working for peace for many years, and they are members of FIDH. Sibylyansky and the Center of Civil Society from Ukraine and Memorial, they are members of FIDH. So, FDH, I won't tell you that we are very efficient in our work nowadays, but there is an old rule. If you can do something, do it. If you can't say something, when you can't say something openly, publicly, then take notes, pencil down. We continue to do this. Maybe as our forefathers, our Soviet dissidents, they wanted to get a result. Mr. Kovalyov, a very famous Russian dissident who spent 10 years in jail, when we ask him, you are fighting the regime, this regime, but this regime will be there 300 more years. 300 more years, okay. I'm pleased with this term. So at least during his life, he knew that there will be an end to this regime, and he made a path for a new Russia. So we have to think not only to the short-term result. We have to think about a marathon, long-term results. And I explained to my colleagues 20 years ago, it is the only possibility to work nowadays to continue our work.
I think on the back of these very important testimonials from Khaled and Drissa and Alexander, that there's a range, obviously, of contexts, which is really important. And I know this is something for us as an institution, because sometimes the legal and institutional protections and guarantees exist, but quite often they don't exist at all, as we see, and it's very different. So I think for us, the first thing is understanding context is really, really important. And this is something that we need to work with the defenders on the ground in order to understand the obstacles and how to go about them. There are places where these protections exist, but they're weak. And I think then what we try to do is, I think, work with the state, but also with the stakeholders to try to understand how we can improve the implementation of the law and protection. And it requires from us a lot of these mechanisms of trust building and also the capacity building. I mean, simply the technical. We said sometimes, Drissa was saying, they don't even know what international human rights law or humanitarian law is all about. And where these don't exist, particularly in situations of conflict or, in this case, occupation, I think, then we have to constantly remind of the importance of compliance. And I say sometimes openly, sometimes back channel diplomacy, but I think how we apply pressure consistently and how we work with other partners to make sure that that pressure is consistent and very public. And I think then we also have to talk about peace building. We spoke about prevention, which I think is very important, but I think that peace building and community outreach and dialogue and building from the ground up to make sure that we can particularly use some tools. We've done this in Central African Republic, in Liberia, understanding trust building and peace building and building up the trust deficit. So I think working more with civil society actors, even in this very difficult time, more generally, including human rights defenders, and building these coalitions between regional and international institutions is really important. So just because of that range of...
Yeah, thank you. Chiara, maybe would you like to add something, because I know you have to leave us very soon.
No, thank you. I fully agree. I think we really also need to exercise a maximum of flexibility in the toolbox of interventions that we can take to support and protect, and really be in a listening mode to see what is the best received in that specific country or regional context. I take also very much the point on dialogue, and I think it is indeed our institutional duty to pursue these dialogues also with non-like-minded, or even more with not like-minded. We were talking before this meeting that we often do bonding, and we should do much more bridging towards non-like-minded, and really it is important that we continue through human rights dialogues, through other means, to really have frank discussions on what is happening when we see serious violations of human rights as it goes. And last point I think it was extremely important to stress from your side that indeed the first point for people, for victims, for survivors to have their rights redressed or repaired is to be aware that this is a possibility at all, and to be accompanied in doing that. So the crucial importance of those of you who work on accountability, on supporting the legal processes, which indeed are marathons and require so many resources and resilience. There one interesting point maybe from the EU side, which we would add to our toolbox, is this idea of a global observatory against impunity that we are going to launch as a competitive call for proposal for non-governmental organizations. So I also use this platform to encourage you to have a look into it, because we really, through a study which was more than 1 year long and consultations, we looked at the accountability gaps, and we really would like to facilitate coordination, share of information, of experience of such cases of serious violation of human rights, and also support capacity on the ground to collect and then to use this evidence at the regional and national level, and also this observatory should help us to support victims and survivors in their access to justice on the ground and local actors. So it's just an additional tool I do hope will be of use.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid, again, we're running late and we're not going to have time for questions, but our speakers are around, so now you've identified them. I'm sure you can breach the topic of your choice with them over coffee break. One word, and I know Chiara has to leave, but I'd like to just ask our 3 human rights defenders representatives in one word only, not more, maybe 2, but that's all. What is your what gives you hope for the future in your function, in your cause? What gives you hope for the future? One word, Khaled.
I believe that.
One word. That's 3 already.
Political pressure on Israel to stop their crimes against the Palestinians.
Thank you. Drissa. It's a difficult one, I know.
Quand on voit le résultat.
When we see the result that we reached in Guinea, I believe that we can move mountains.
Старший товарищ.
Well, Russia is not just Putin. We have over 200 years of experience fighting for freedom together with other nations. Спасибо.
Before we leave for coffee break, just a couple of housekeeping points, quick ones, but the sessions